It was a chilly autumn evening when Lisa and Mark arrived at their Airbnb destination, a quaint and charming cottage nestled deep in the woods. The drive had been long, and the sun was setting as they pulled up the gravel driveway. The cottage looked like something out of a fairy tale, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and a small garden filled with overgrown flowers swaying in the wind. The reviews had been glowing, describing it as a cozy escape from reality, and that was exactly what Lisa and Mark needed. As they stepped inside, they were greeted by the warm scent of cedar wood and the comforting crackle of a fire already burning in the hearth. The host had left a note on the kitchen counter. "Welcome, make yourselves at home. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call. Enjoy your stay." The couple smiled at each other, relieved that everything seemed perfect. The cottage was small, but beautifully decorated, with antique furniture and soft, dim lighting that created a cozy, intimate atmosphere. The living room was inviting, with a plush sofa facing the fireplace, and the kitchen was stocked with all the essentials. The bedroom, however, was the real gem. It featured a large, comfortable bed with thick blankets, and the window offered a stunning view of the forest, now shrouded in the darkness of night. After unpacking their bags, they decided to unwind with a glass of wine by the fire. The silence of the woods was almost eerie, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But inside, it was warm and comforting, and they felt far removed from the stresses of their daily lives. As the night deepened, they decided to turn in. The bed was as comfortable as it looked, and within minutes they both drifted off into a peaceful sleep. But that peace was shattered in the early hours of the morning. Lisa woke suddenly, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what had woken her, but something felt off. She glanced at the clock on the bedside table. It was just past 3 a.m. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. She lay still, listening to the quiet, trying to discern what had disturbed her. And then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible click, like the sound of a camera shutter. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained to hear more. Was it just her imagination? She turned over to wake Mark, but he was fast asleep, oblivious to the growing unease that was now gripping her. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was nothing, just the creaking of the old house or the distant sound of an animal outside. But as she lay there, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, gnawing at her, making it impossible to relax. The next morning, Lisa brushed off the unease, convincing herself that it had been nothing more than a bad dream. She didn't mention it to Mark, not wanting to ruin the mood of their getaway. They spent the day exploring the nearby town, enjoying the crisp air and the vibrant autumn colors. But as the sun began to set once more, that feeling of dread started to creep back in. When they returned to the cottage, the atmosphere felt different. The warmth that had welcomed them the previous night seemed to have dissipated, leaving a cold, oppressive air in its place. The shadows cast by the flickering fire seemed longer, darker, and Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. As they prepared for bed, she noticed something strange. The smoke detector on the ceiling above the bed seemed out of place. It was larger than usual, and there was something about it that made her skin crawl. She tried to ignore it, telling herself she was being paranoid, but the thought nagged at her, refusing to be dismissed. After Mark had fallen asleep, Lisa lay awake, staring up at the smoke detector. The more she looked at it, the more certain she became that something was wrong. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she climbed out of bed and stood on the chair, reaching up to inspect the device. Her hands trembled as she touched the plastic cover. It felt heavier than a normal smoke detector, and when she gently pried it open, her worst fears were confirmed. Inside, hidden among the wires and circuits, was a tiny camera lens, pointed directly at the bed. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the camera, her mind reeling. Who had put this here? How long had it been recording? And most horrifying of all, who was watching? She rushed to wake Mark, her voice trembling as she explained what she had found. He looked at her in disbelief, then at the camera, his expression darkening with anger and fear. Without a word, he grabbed his phone and called the host, demanding answers. The host's voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. He denied any knowledge of the camera, insisting that the cottage had been rented out many times before without any issues. But there was something in his tone, something cold and detached, that sent chills down Lisa's spine. Mark hung up and immediately called the police, but the nearest station was miles away, and they were told it would take time for officers to arrive. In the meantime, Lisa and Mark gathered their belongings, determined to leave the cottage and never return. As they waited in the living room, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside seemed magnified, ominous. They felt trapped, exposed, knowing that somewhere someone had been watching them, someone who might still be watching. Finally, they heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. They looked out the window expecting to see the police, but instead they saw an unfamiliar car pull up. A man stepped out, his face obscured by the shadows. He walked slowly towards the cottage, his movements deliberate, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Panic set in. Lisa and Mark backed away from the windows, their hearts racing. They heard the doorknob rattle, and then a loud, insistent knock echoed through the cottage. The man outside called out, his voice muffled but menacing. "I know you're in there. Open the door." Lisa clung to Mark, fear overwhelming her. They had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but they knew they couldn't stay. They quietly moved to the back door, slipping out into the darkness, hoping to escape unnoticed. They ran through the woods, the cold night air biting at their skin, branches snapping underfoot. Behind them, they heard the door of the cottage burst open, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps pursuing them. Adrenaline fueled their flight, but fear weighed them down, making every step feel like a struggle. They didn't stop until they reached the main road, breathless and terrified. There, they flagged down a passing car, begging the driver to take them to the nearest police station. When the police finally arrived at the cottage, they found it empty. The man who had chased Lisa and Mark was gone, and there was no sign of him or the car he had arrived in. The camera and the smoke detector was seized as evidence, but no fingerprints or identifying marks were found. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the memory of their terrifying ordeal. Lisa and Mark never found out who had been watching them or why. The experience left them shaken, unable to trust the safety of any place that wasn't their own home. They never rented an Airbnb again, the fear of being watched, of being hunted, too deeply ingrained in their minds. And as they tried to move on with their lives, they couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, out there, the hidden watcher was still looking for them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light barely cutting through the thick veil of clouds that smothered the city below. A chill wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying with it the distant echoes of footsteps that seemed to vanish just as quickly as they appeared. It was on such a night, cloaked in shadows and whispered fears, that Emma found herself standing before a towering, ancient apartment building, her fingers trembling as she clutched her phone. She was a traveler, a wanderer by nature, who had always been drawn to the unknown corners of the world. But tonight, something was different. Something was wrong. Emma had arrived in the city earlier that day, her heart filled with the excitement of exploring a new place. She had booked an Airbnb in a part of town that was said to be full of character. The reviews were positive, and the host, a man named Victor, had been nothing but polite in their communications. Yet as she stood there in the oppressive darkness, a sense of unease began to creep over her. The building, with its cracked windows and faded paint, loomed over her like a forgotten relic of a time long past. She shook off the feeling and stepped inside, her boots echoing on the worn marble floor of the lobby. The place was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the old elevator in the corner. She pressed the button for the 4th floor, and the doors creaked open with a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. The elevator groaned as it ascended, the lights flickering ominously before settling into a dim, unsettling glow. When the doors finally opened, she was met with a long, narrow hallway lined with closed doors. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing patches of damp, moldy walls beneath. The air was thick with the smell of something she couldn't quite place. Something earthy, like wet soil or decaying leaves. She hesitated for a moment before stepping out, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet beneath her. Room 402, she murmured to herself as she walked down the hall, her eyes scanning the numbers on the doors. At last, she found it, the brass numbers tarnished and barely visible in the dim light. She reached into her pocket for the key Victor had left for her in a small lockbox outside the building. As she inserted the key into the lock, she noticed something strange. The door to the adjacent apartment, room 401, was slightly ajar. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and glanced at the open door. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move inside, but when she blinked, it was gone. Shaking her head, she turned the key and pushed open the door to her own room. The apartment was small but cozy, furnished with an assortment of mismatched furniture that gave it a certain charm. A single lamp in the corner cast a warm glow over the room, and the bed looked inviting after a long day of travel. She set her bags down and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering unease that clung to her. But as the night wore on, that unease only grew. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something about the apartment that felt off. The air seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible energy, like the static charge before a storm. And then there was the silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that pressed down on her like a physical weight. Unable to sleep, Emma decided to explore the apartment a bit more. She walked over to the window and pulled back the curtains, expecting to see the city skyline or the lights of passing cars. But all she saw was darkness, thick, impenetrable darkness that seemed to swallow up everything beyond the glass. She frowned and stepped back, her heart beginning to race. It was then that she heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the hallway outside her door. She froze, her ears straining to catch the words, but they were too soft, too muffled. Cautiously, she crept over to the door and pressed her ear against it. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, but still, she couldn't make out what was being said. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly turned the doorknob and peered out into the hallway. The door to room 401 was still ajar, but now there was a faint light spilling out from within. She could see the outline of a figure standing just inside the doorway, their back turned to her. The whispering was louder now, almost frantic, and it seemed to be coming from the figure. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, its head slightly bowed, as if listening to something only it could hear. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she took a step back, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get out of that building as fast as she could. But something kept her rooted to the spot, a morbid curiosity that she couldn't quite shake. Slowly, she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Victor's number. The phone rang once, twice, and then he answered, his voice smooth and calm. "Hello, Emma. Is everything all right?" She glanced back at the figure in the hallway, her voice barely a whisper. "Victor, there's someone in the apartment next to mine. They're just standing there, and I can hear them whispering." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Victor spoke again, his tone cold and detached. "Emma, there's no one in the apartment next to yours. That room has been empty for years." Her blood ran cold as his words sank in, her mind reeling. "But I can see them. They're right there." "Leave," Victor said, his voice suddenly sharp. "Leave now, Emma. Get out of the building and don't look back." But it was too late. As she turned to grab her bag, the lights in her apartment flickered and then went out, plunging her into darkness. The whispering grew louder, filling her ears, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. She could feel the figure's presence now, closer, almost right behind her. Desperate, she stumbled toward the door, her fingers fumbling with the lock. But before she could turn the knob, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder, its grip like ice. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat, too terrified to move. The whispering was in her ear now, the words unintelligible but filled with malice. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The hand on her shoulder released its grip, and she was left standing in the dark, alone. With a shaking hand, she finally managed to unlock the door and fled down the hallway, not daring to look back. She didn't stop running until she was out of the building, out on the street, gasping for air under the pale light of the moon. She never went back for her things. She never contacted Victor again. And she never ever booked an Airbnb in a strange city again. To this day, Emma doesn't know what she saw that night in room 401, and she doesn't want to know. All she knows is that something evil lived in that building, something that still haunts her nightmares. And sometimes, when she's alone at night, she can still hear the whispering, faint and far away, but always there, waiting. The night was thick with mist as the group of friends approached the old mansion, its silhouette looming against the moonlit sky. The Airbnb listing had described it as a charming historic home, but now, standing before it, the word that came to mind was foreboding. The house seemed to breathe with the past, its dark windows like eyes watching their every move. Emily, the most curious of the group, had been the one to book the place. She was drawn to its rich history, intrigued by the tales of its former owners, an old family that had mysteriously disappeared a century ago. The house had remained abandoned for decades before it was restored and put up for rent. Despite the warnings from the locals about strange happenings, Emily had insisted they spend the weekend here, eager to experience the house's atmosphere. As they stepped inside, the air grew cold, much colder than outside. The interior was a time capsule of a bygone era, ornate furniture, dusty portraits on the walls, and chandeliers that flickered eerily. It was as if the house had been waiting for them. The first night passed uneventfully, though each of them had a vague sense of unease, a feeling that something was just out of sight watching. They tried to shake it off, laughing nervously as they explored the rooms, but the house had a way of seeping into their minds. The next day, the group split up to explore the surrounding woods, but Emily stayed behind, fascinated by the mansion. She wandered through its hallways, each turn revealing more of the house's secrets. She found herself in a room that hadn't been mentioned in the listing, a small library filled with old leather-bound books. The air in the room was stifling, and she noticed a large portrait above the fireplace. It depicted a stern-looking man, his eyes cold and piercing, as if he were staring right at her. A chill ran down Emily's spine as she realized the man in the portrait bore a striking resemblance to one of her friends, Daniel. She couldn't shake the feeling that the portrait was somehow connected to the house's dark past, but she pushed the thought aside, attributing it to her overactive imagination. That night, things began to unravel. They were gathered around the fireplace, telling stories and sipping wine, when the atmosphere in the room suddenly changed. The air grew heavy, and the fire dimmed as a sense of dread settled over them. Out of nowhere, a door slammed shut upstairs, echoing through the house. They froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" whispered Sarah, her voice trembling. "Probably just the wind," Daniel said, though his voice lacked conviction. But it wasn't the wind. Footsteps began to echo from the floor above, slow and deliberate. It sounded as if someone, or something, was pacing back and forth, just out of sight. "Who's up there?" Emily called out, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer. The footsteps continued, growing louder, more insistent. "I think we should check it out," said Mark, the most skeptical of the group. He grabbed a flashlight and started toward the staircase. Reluctantly, the others followed. As they ascended the creaking stairs, the air grew colder, and the house seemed to groan around them, as if protesting their intrusion. The footsteps stopped as they reached the top of the stairs, leaving them in an oppressive silence. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from Mark's flashlight. They moved slowly, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, and it was from there that the noise seemed to have come. Mark pushed the door open with a trembling hand. The room was empty, save for an old rocking chair that creaked slowly back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn, and yet the chair moved on its own. "I'm getting out of here," Sarah whispered, backing away. But as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in. They fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if some unseen force was holding it shut, trapping them inside. The temperature in the room dropped even further, their breath visible in the cold air. And then they heard it, a soft, malevolent whisper coming from the shadows. "Get out." The voice was low and guttural, filled with a hatred that sent chills down their spines. It was coming from the corner of the room, where the darkness seemed to thicken, coalescing into a shape. A figure stepped forward, barely visible in the dim light. A man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was the man from the portrait. Emily screamed, and the others tried to break down the door, but it was as if the house itself was holding them captive, forcing them to confront whatever haunted its walls. The figure moved closer, its footsteps echoing ominously in the room. The temperature dropped even further, the cold seeping into their bones. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling their minds with a sense of impending doom. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figure disappeared, the door swung open, and the warmth returned to the room. They didn't wait to question what had happened. They bolted from the house, not stopping until they were safely outside. As they stood in the cool night air, catching their breath, they looked back at the house. It stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened, but they knew better. The house was alive with the past, its walls steeped in darkness, and they had only scratched the surface. They didn't stay another night. They packed their things and left at dawn, leaving the house and its sinister secrets behind. But as they drove away, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the house was still with them, lurking in the shadows of their minds. And perhaps it always would be. For the house was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a vessel for something far older and darker, a malevolent force that had claimed countless lives over the centuries. And those who dared to enter its doors were doomed to become a part of its tragic history, their souls forever bound to the haunted house. The group never spoke of their experience again, but they were forever changed. The memory of that night lingered in their minds, a dark shadow that haunted their dreams. They had come face to face with the unknown, and it had left its mark on them, a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets buried in the past.